Well, hello, and welcome to the Sprinklr Coffee Club. I'm Marshall Kirkpatrick, your host here at the Sprinklr Coffee Club. This is a show where we talk about social media, about customer experience, about digital transformation, and about changing the world. So much to talk about today, and I am really excited to introduce our guest, a foremother of the revolution, the one and only Deb Shultz. Deb, thanks so much for joining us today.
Hey, Marshall, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, I'm so excited to have you on the show. So our guest today, Deb Schultz, has had trailblazing experience at a variety of places over the years, from the foundational blogging platform called Six Apart, to the Procter & Gamble Social Innovation Labs, to Altimeter Research, the premier boutique analyst firm that many folks watch closely online. And now Deb is with us here today to share some of her lessons learned from those experiences and some thoughts about how we can continue to move this whole thing, the internet and the world, in a more positive direction. So Deb, thanks for taking the time to join us.
Of course. Deb, I can talk about this stuff forever.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, me too. So I want to encourage everybody, if you've got a cup of coffee, take a big gulp because there's a lot to talk about. I want to start, Deb, with your tagline, if you will. A lot of places where people see you around the internet, they will see the phrase, technology changes, humans don't. Is that right? And what does that mean?
Yeah, that's right. And it's something that I think I said at this point, maybe almost 15 years ago. And these days I get a lot of slack about it because there are people who miss my intention and will say, what are you talking about? People change all the time. And I'm like, no, I said humans. And I think human nature and who we are and what drives us and what makes us excited and what gets us out of bed in the morning and why we want to connect to people. And all of that is a foundational element, whether it's Maslow's hierarchy or whatever. And don't get caught up in the shiny object of whatever tech is, because tech moves incredibly fast. And to get caught up in the latest thing means that you're sort of missing the underpinnings of why people get excited about that technology. To this day, I always bemoan the fact that people call it social media, because I think it's really like social. I don't think of myself as creating media. I never thought of myself as creating media when I was posting things. I think of myself as sharing my life. Now, these days, you've got Instagram influencers and business, and it's a little bit different, but still, social participation or something might have changed the whole tenor of the way the industry became. So I always also say that, like, it's not about the technology and the channel. You can use a telephone call. You can use a telephone to tell someone you love them on Valentine's Day or hire a hitman. It's not about the technology.
Yes. Well, here on the Sprinklr Coffee Club, we're going to lean towards the "we love you" on Valentine's Day. But it could go either way, potentially. You're right. That's a great point. So given that, it brought to mind when we were preparing for the show, another thinker, Gerald Kane, and he has a phrase where he says, technology changes faster than individuals, that change faster than organizations, that change faster than laws and culture. That's a complicated situation. How does that strike you?
I couldn't agree with him more. I mean, that's, I think, exactly what larger businesses, even smaller businesses, even startups run up against. I've worked with both. I've spoken to both sides of that equation, and different challenges and issues for each type of organization. But it's always about the human interaction, what we're trying to do together, what is our intention with each other, whether it's our intention because with a nonprofit, whether you're an activist, what's our intention? And it's always about that. And so, when when I talk to startups, I've always said to them, look, you are not going to have, hopefully, a smaller ratio of customers to employees as you do today. Like your object is probably to have more customers, maybe. And so here's your opportunity to talk directly to your customers in a much easier way than if you are a large P&G and you have to figure out a different sense of mechanisms to understand who your customers are and what they're doing. And so if you don't have everyone in your company at a smaller company touching the customer in some way, then you're in trouble. So I think that's sort of what Gerald is getting at, that, you know, digital transformation and transformational change. Yes, it's about the systems, but and the technology and the tools you're using. Some are clunkier than others, but you can have the best systems in the world, and if you don't have the right culture, you're not going to be that 21st century, for want of a better term, organization.
What kind of culture works best for engaging with your customers and listening to your customers like that? How would you describe that kind of culture?
I'd say that kind of culture is has to be a culture that is built on a high risk tolerance and a willingness to make mistakes. So, you know, if you're going to talk directly to your customers and ask them questions, you have to be willing to hear things you don't want to hear. You have to be understand. If you want to co-collaborate with your customers, you have to be willing to get them involved in the process earlier and, you know, look behind the curtain, you know, a la Wizard of Oz. And I found, you know, in my early work at Six Apart and other places, that the quicker you bring your customers along with you, the more forgiving they will be, because it's a relationship. It's a back and forth. If you just view it as one way, then it's not going to get you anywhere. Like, I'm glad, I think we're past the era of every large organization saying they have a customer community. And I'm like, no, I'm your customer. I'm not part of your community. Being part of your community is a very different thing than just being your customer. And that's about some of the things we just talked about, like transparency, getting me involved, being willing to listen, and etc.
So it's definitely a dynamic environment. Things have
Yes.
been changing. They'll continue to change. What's the Deb Shultz theory of change? How do you believe we can change the world, Deb? Any advice?
Change the world. Listen to each other more. And actually, to be a little more serious, empathy. Empathy is the number one thing that the world needs more of. And when I mean empathy, it doesn't mean, oh, I feel your pain. It means understanding and being able to put yourself in the other person's position. I think that's number one. I think the other thing, and I've been thinking about this recently, and even before I knew we were going to talk today, is I'm really fed up with our gotcha culture. You know, human beings are malleable. We can change. We are not binary. We are not zeros and ones. And yet we're living in a world where, you know, you make one mistake and you're kicked to the curb, or you say one thing and it follows you for 10 years. And there's no understanding that you might change. Like, we've lost our ability to sort of allow people, organizations, etc., to grow. And I refer to that as gotcha. We're living in a gotcha culture. And, you know, for lots of reasons, media outlets needing headlines, people on social media trolling and jumping on someone right away. And I think those two things are sort of inherent in what we're dealing with at the moment.
It makes me think about the concept of Lashon Hara.
Very well said.
Thanks. My understanding is that it's a term that says once someone has made amends to the best of their ability as around something that they have done wrong, it is essential to social cohesion that they be forgiven, or that at least we not actively point fingers at them and continue to shame them when it doesn't serve any clear social purpose, lest people refuse to acknowledge wrongdoing out of fear that they will never be forgiven.
Right.
Is that fair? Is that a fair summary?
It is. It's not exactly what Lashon Hara is, and we can talk about that. That Lashon Hara is really gossiping, but the reason that you don't is for that reason. Is that there's a lot of stuff inherent in Judaism around how to keep, cohesion, and a lot of my thoughts about online and offline community. I joked. I once did a funny Ignite talk about it. If you want to understand social media, ask a Jew. So it's like. Or online community. There's a lot, and any organization that is malleable, that has adapted to change, has a certain amount of. So the other thing that we need in culture, in business and organizations and our culture today for change to happen, is you need and it's different for every organization. Is what is the amount of guardrails and rules we need in place to keep a sense of cohesion, but also allow for adaptability. And I think looking at those kind of organisms and structures and business orgs and groups that work well, those are the ones that get this world that everything's moving fast and changing fast.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and a lot of people talk about trust being the most important thing today because we've all lost trust. And so I'm moving on when I talk about empathy to, well, in order to have trust, you need to have empathy, and once you have empathy, hopefully you can understand that people and organizations can make mistakes and change. And I feel like we're living in a very black and white world where that's not acknowledged, sadly. But I mean, it's good. It's okay. There's plenty of gray happening out there, but in a good way. I like to use gray in the good sense of black and white together.
Yeah, right on. So speaking of wisdom from Judaism, right, that can be applied to the internet. One of the projects that you have worked on for a number of years now is a podcast called Tummel Vision with Heather Gold and Kevin Marks. And it is all about this incredible concept called tummeling. And I wonder if you could tell us about that.
Absolutely. One of my favorite topics. So a tumbler was someone who was the more modern definition of it. It referred to someone in the probably 40s and 50s, who was a comedian up in the Borscht Belt in the Catskills of New York. If anyone's watched The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, they go to the summer bungalow colony. The comedians there, those are the tumblers. And actually, I got a lot of pings last year because they used the word in one of the episodes. And everyone's like, did you hear it? And the reason that that's interesting and that we use this term, and I'll tell you where it came from is really interesting, why we use it, is tumblers were hired to be comedians, but they broke that fourth wall early. So what they would do is they would have a Saturday night show or Friday night show, but they were there all week. And so all week, their job was to sort of connect people and, learn about them and say, hey, Madge, did you know that Mo is here? And he's interested in this, and you might be interested in that. And the way that they do that is through a really sense of, also their style of comedy was a lot of vulnerability, a lot of making fun of themselves in order to make everyone feel comfortable. And often those stories, because they knew their audience and got to know them well, would end up on stage. Right. And that was a really crazy concept. Now we're a little more used to that in the last 15, 20 years because of social media. But that idea that it wasn't your own unique joke, you were bringing the audience in, was crazy. They were also hired in a slightly different term, which I also like to talk about. Tumblers were hired at weddings in the Middle Ages to get everyone to dance. So to me, in today's world where everyone is connected and networked, and being the smartest person in the room, the CEO is rarely the smartest person in the room, right? A good leader knows how to catalyze others to action. And that's really, my sort of those two characteristics of tumbling really resonate for what we need to do more of today. And so that's why I love the term. And, and it came about 10, 12 years ago when Clay Shirky wrote the book, Here Comes Everybody. And Kevin and I were sitting at a conference at Supernova, and we all looked at each other and said, Okay, but if they come, then what do you do with them? Everyone's online. What's going to happen if you don't have tumblers in place and people like that? It's going to be chaos. Now, this is 15 years ago. And the person and we were like, we hate the terms community manager. We hate the term social media manager. All those, they first of all, they unfortunately tend to be looked at as non-strategic roles. And I actually think that this role and this person, now you have companies that have chief culture officers, is a little bit getting to that. I actually think the CEO is a Tumblr. And we were like, what do we call it? And Teresa Nielsen Hayden, who was the first moderator on one of the early blogs on, now I'm going to blank. I'm blanking where she was, who came up with brilliant community management protocols back in the day. She came up with disemvoweling, and I can explain what that is for the audience. She said, well, why don't you refer to Tumblrs? And I'm like, as the resident, not the only, but as the 12 years of Jewish education person in the room, I was like, whack, of course. Because that's the kind of whether it's a person or a skill set or a department or whatever, that's what we need more of. You can't just put everyone online and see what happens, or put features, online. And here we are 15 years later with people talking about the toxic internet and social media is terrible and all this kind of things. And so we used to talk a lot. So to me, when I talk about tunnel vision, I also sometimes talk to product folks and say, have you thought of how this feature is going to impact the nature of your platform? Have you thought of it? So there's imagine Twitter without the knowing how many people are following you. Imagine, and it's funny, a few weeks ago, Instagram said they're going to start toying with getting rid of the like button. I mean, imagine how that impacts culture. So one of the things that's also important to think about is, whether it's tumbling or some of the other work that you and I talk about and try to do and help your clients understand, is every feature you put in place sets a tone. If you're going to make like a big thing, then you're making popularity a big thing. Then so what very subtle culture building moments, and that can be internally as an organization with your wiki, you are what you measure. There's a lot around that. And so really understanding those implications is, what I think is important. And that's what tumblers do, or tumbling is about.
That's beautiful. Well, that makes me think about the idea that it is a company's own culture that shapes the software that it produces, which then shapes the culture of the people who use it. And so, really, really important for so many different reasons to consider your own company's culture. And as you discussed tumbling, another perhaps sister idea that comes to mind is Dan Pink's discussion of what he calls symphonic thinking. The ability to create value through the willful connection of seemingly disparate people or concepts, which I think the internet and social media just make possible on a whole new level.
Absolutely, if you have the right. And I will get a link. This is a good link I should have looked up beforehand, but the conductor, has in an orchestra, can have, it's not completely tumbling, because to me a conductor is a real tumbler would be down in the pit with the orchestra instead of up on stage, like being the maestro, which is more of a a leader in our flattening organizational world is in the pit with you, kind of like in the mosh pit with the organization, not up front. But but look at what he can do, or she, a maestro can really, through phatic communication, through subtle exchanges, really bring out the best in everybody in that group. And there's no specific framework. They've had a relationship with that person. They know who that musician is, and what that musician needs at that moment. Right.
That sounds akin to another generative approach to social engagement that Esteban Kolsky talks about, where he says that that companies are increasingly seeing customer care not as a cost center, but as an opportunity to capture strategic insight about their customers, about their product, about their strategy, and that making those connections to help solve people's problems through customer care can be a massively strategic, generative action. Have you seen
Absolutely.
that evolve more and more over the years?
It's starting to. It's definitely evolved, and I think it depends on what kind of business and at what stage, and are you a services platform company? Because to me, customer experience is the entire. It is making sure your customer has a great experience from start to finish. In the startup world, customer experience is referred to as customer support. So I think it when someone says a customer experience role in tech and startup, it's usually customer support. And I think there's a disconnect of an opportunity there. And I've always wondered, and this is now being in the working world for 25 years, why the people who are closest to the customer, again, are treated the least strategically. And this goes back 25 years ago when I was at Citibank early in my career, and I blew in there as a temp who knew PageMaker, and then ended up doing corporate events for them and did some really cool stuff. And when I had to, one event we had to sort of, God, they were old discs. We had to load up some software on a computer, and, nobody knew what was wrong. And the only people that knew what was wrong with that piece of software were the customer service people who'd spent the last year and a half getting phone calls about it and getting workarounds. But had anyone in the product side of the organization talked to those folks? No. So they kept building in the same issues. So again, I bring up that example only to point out that it's nothing new. I think the nature of social media companies, not being able to, having to be more transparent, the news cycle we live in, things can't be hidden anymore. Companies are realizing they better treat their customers better. I would like to see customer support viewed more as customer experience. It is the part of the entire chain of how you take care of your customers.
Agreed. I think there's big opportunities in that direction, and I think that
Yes.
many savvy organizations are moving in that direction already. So
they are.
Deb,
I have seen that change. Absolutely.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. So speaking of your experience at various organizations, I wonder if you might do us the favor of sharing perhaps one of your favorite lessons learned from one of these other organizations that you have worked at over the years. Say, do you have a favorite lesson learned from your time at P&G doing social innovation, for example?
Yes, I do. One concrete example. Let me talk at a little bit of a higher level of overall. The project was almost 2 years, and the innovation lab was very early in this lab concept, and we set it up so that startups and large brands would do a bunch of live pilots with each other and really learn, teaching P&G a whole new framework for how to deal with customers in this universe. And, some of the lessons that I learned from that, not necessarily from P&G, was what I loved was that we put people in the lab, and brands was the importance of sort of hiding the name of the shiny object from companies. So in other words, the tech platforms and the software that we used, the brands were not seeing what the name of the company was when they did an experiment with them ahead of time. They looked at the value proposition so that people wouldn't say, I need to get on Facebook or Instagram. So that was really interesting, like really thinking of ways to get that value proposition down. My biggest personal lesson, having learned with P&G, was this one. You can imagine it's about 10 years ago, a little bit, maybe more now, and the world's largest advertiser is coming to talk to me, someone who is not a big advertising person, to put it mildly, an early signer of Doc's Clue Chain Manifesto and trying to change the world. And they're like, Deb, could you help us sort of do this? Now, I'm not, you alluded to this before, I've called myself someone else called me a practical utopian at some point, which means I'm not going to go in there and change minds by being a real, you guys don't get it. I'm a bridge builder. I'm a tumbler. So when they came calling, at first I was like, oh, come on, guys, do you really want to start a Tide blog? Is that what we're talking about? And they were very quickly, this is what makes them one of the smartest companies in the world. We're like, no, that is not what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do is understand the mechanisms, understand what's at play here, see where and if this is even appropriate for our company, this meaning all this new social tools and things. And I said, but okay, you guys just are about big and I'm all about relationship driven stuff. And they're like, I mean, for instance, and we had this really great conversation that's what I'm pointing out. They are a company that's willing to listen and make mistakes. And I said, come on, like, for instance, do you really need 30 different tides? Come on. I mean, what a waste, right? And their response was, hold on, Deb. You're always telling us that we need to be, customized and personal for individuals and give the customer what they want. That's how we do it. We've learned that people want 20, so my big learning there was that how smart large organizations are and how, the joke cliche later was that, companies and corporations are made up of people. And different people at different parts of companies have different points of view, and that makes it really interesting. It's just one example that shows me in a more of a vulnerable light, meaning like I made bad assumptions about the P&Gs of the world and learned a lot from them. And over the years, I've seen them do a lot of really great work and change a lot. So there's so many lessons I learned from that. At 6 Apart, where we were a company that basically sold the megaphones to everybody, right? So you can imagine when our servers went down and no one could blog at that time, horrifying, right? And yet we made a decision as a company, and our CEO and founders and all of us got in a room and they were like, look, our servers have been down for 24 hours. These are people who, make their livelihood, and we have to give them something back for this, right? And sorry about that. And what we did was we gave customers a choice. Great example. We wrote back to our customers and gave them a choice. And we said, how much has this outage impacted you? No, not at all. A little bit. Give me a month free. A lot. I need whatever. And we were very transparent and very customized with them and really heard them. And you'd be surprised how many people said, no, it's okay. You listened, you heard. That's where one of my biggest lessons on trusting your customers and making yourselves vulnerable. And from that moment on, it was a huge aha to me. We're talking like 15 years ago now, that, wow, if you talk plainly and say right up front, the first email we sent to them is we screwed up, changes the whole tenor of everything. When companies have to learn to do that more, and they have to be given space to do that more.
That's beautiful. What about one of your latest projects, the Yes and Yes Yes conference series? Is there a lesson that was your favorite that you've taken so far from that?
Oh man, how Yes and Yes Yes is an Uber unconference. We got together. There's 2 lessons learned from that. One is having four kick-ass female co-founders. You can get a lot done because all of us do Yes and part-time. And there was a very different culture in how we worked together than I've had in other environments. It could be a Harvard Business School case study on leadership and connection. Everyone always had each other's back. We did this from 5 different continents at certain points. So there's a lot of lessons learned. And once you have trust and intention up front, what you can accomplish as a group. And then the other thing was that if you understand what you're trying to do and you ask people, are you willing to jump in the pool with us with no risk? Literally and figuratively in this case, they'll do it. So in other words, the idea for Yes came across where we were like, we think that this kind of gathering is missing in the universe today. A place where people can not be structured, connect both socially and in a business way. And so we emailed a whole bunch of people and told them, this is what we're trying to do. If we bootstrapped the first year and said, if you're willing to give us X amount of dollars, we'll make it happen. And people jumped in. So people are willing to jump in when you're transparent. And also the same thing, people need wayfaring signs. They need to understand, like our big lesson was the first year, we just sort of, okay, everybody just have fun kind of deal. And then the second and third year, we realized that works for some people, the extroverts. You'd think the Tumblr would understand this, but it doesn't really work for those who feel a little more shy, even though our culture is really inclusive. So we put some things in place to help remind people in a very concrete way how they could participate, how they could help others participate. Are you a very participatory person? Are you an extrovert? Why don't you reach out to someone else? And we set the tone from the beginning. So this goes back to the culture. I know I want to be cognizant of time, but it goes back to the culture. Like we knew what our culture was going to be and what we wanted it to be from the get-go. And everything we did set that tone. The first email that we wrote, every email after, we never took any of our quote unquote customers for granted. We were hosting an event and setting the table. They were bringing themselves and all their skills and talents to the room. So viewing it wasn't our event, it was their event. And it still is. It's your community. How can we make it better?
That's beautiful. Those are some great lessons learned and some really great insights, Deb. And
Thanks.
I'm so glad to get a chance to share them with the Sprinklr Coffee Club community. I feel smarter and inspired to get to have this conversation with you.
Inspired. Now you're speaking to my heart.
Oh, good. So if you would like to connect with Deb on outside of this context on an ongoing basis, you can. Deb, what's the best way to do that?
You can reach out on Twitter. It's because it's my shortest handle anywhere, at Debs on Twitter, or my website address is my email is Deborah Shultz at Gmail. So you can just Google me and find me that way. But
right on.
ping me on
Yeah,
Twitter.
we connected here on Twitter in particular to bring together this conversation. And thank you so much to everyone who joined us here today. We hope that you will give a little like and subscribe to the Sprinklr YouTube channel so that you can see future episodes of Coffee Club. But today has been really fun and really, really helpful and inspiring. So Deb, thanks again. I'll look forward to the next time we get to speak. And I hope that everyone out there has a wonderful afternoon. Take care.